Hello and welcome to this month's ChemEng Evolution webinar, which is all about energy. My name is Yasmin Ali. I'm a chartered chemical engineer based in the UK, and I've worked in the energy sector for the last 12 years or so, and I've seen huge changes in that time, not only in the industry, but in my own career as well. I started out working in fossil fuels, and I now work on green hydrogen project development for RWE, and that just wasn't even a topic when I started my career. About 100 years ago, my grandparents were born in Iraq in the Middle East. Their childhoods would have been hugely different to mine. No TV, doing all of their washing and laundry by hand. They wouldn't have even thought about getting on a plane to go to some far-flung country for a holiday. And most different, I think, from my perspective, is that they shared the planet with only 2 billion other people. By the time I came around, that was 5 billion. So that was the population of the planet at the time. And anyone born today will share this world with almost 8 billion other humans. That population growth is absolutely enormous over the last 100 years. And it can only really be sustained with a secure supply of energy. There are factories all over the world that produce fertilizer to grow enough food to feed everyone. We've got electricity running life-saving medical equipment 24/7, and living standards have improved over the years and they continue to do so. But as I'm sure you all know, that's not quite the full story. Energy poverty drives inequality across the world, and the fossil fuels that we've relied on for the past 100 years have been a major contributor to climate change. It's absolutely vital that we close the energy poverty gap and reduce inequality. And as people's living standards continue to get better, we will keep traveling and we will keep demanding energy. We are where we are today, that's the fact, and we can't go back and undo that. So the question is, where do we go from here? How do we redefine the energy mix and get to net zero? And what is the role of chemical engineering, and what's our role as chemical engineers in all of this? So these are the issues that we're going to be talking about today over the next 90 minutes. We're going to kick off with each of our panelists speaking for about 5 to 10 minutes. And I'll then ask them a couple of questions to get the discussion started. And after that, I will come to you for your audience questions. So please do listen and reflect on what they say. And if you've got questions, put them into the Q&A box, and I will try to get through as many as possible in the next hour and a half. So let's kick off with an outlook on fossil fuels and the future energy mix from our first panelist, Neil Loader. Neil is VP for Carbon Ambition, Strategy and Sustainability at BP. He's responsible for delivering BP's ambition to be a net zero company by 2050 or sooner. So over to you, Neil, and I will share your slides for you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of the panel. As said, my name's Neil Loader. I'm a chartered chemical engineer and a fellow of the IPCC, and I've worked for the last 27 years in the industry for BP in chemical manufacturing and oil and gas production all over the world. I'm just going to start by referring to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which was issued back in April, and I'll come on here to the slides in a moment. But you know, the report said that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius would mean rapid and deep emissions reductions in all sectors of the global economy. The report outlines how these emission cuts could be achieved, including substantial reductions in fossil fuel use, and of course things like energy efficiency and electrification, as well as the rapid uptake of low emission energy sources such as renewables. So, you know, the evidence is fairly clear. It can be read in many, many reports. And I'm going to look here at a couple of charts from the BP Energy Outlook, which we publish annually. This is the 2022 report. And in the Energy Outlook, we look at how the change to the world's energy system might happen. And, we base that on our internal research, but also on many other global data sources, such as the International Energy Agency and others. So the scenarios I'm going to talk to are not predictions of what is going to happen, or indeed what BP would like to happen. They're simply a collection of judgments and assumptions. And of course, they were developed before the terrible events which have happened and continue to happen in the Ukraine. And our thoughts and hopes are with all of those people affected. So the analysis that I'm going to talk to doesn't consider the implications on economic growth or the global energy market from those events, which could have long-lasting impacts. So in the first slide, Yasmin, I think we might be on the second slide. Do you have one before this?
Apologies, Neil. There we go.
Oh, there you go. Thank you very much. That's it. Perfect. Yeah. So let me just switch back to my notes. Yeah. So in the first slide, what we see is that other than the small dip which occurred due to COVID in 2020, carbon emissions have risen, all but with a slowing rate every year since 2015, which was the year of the Paris COP. And of course, you can see the rise was occurring before that. What I have here and what the Energy Outlook considers are three main scenarios, which explore a wide span of outcomes as the world transitions to a lower carbon energy system. We have accelerated, net zero, and new momentum scenarios. And in all three of the scenarios, emissions, this is emissions of CO2 equivalent, exceed pre-COVID levels. And with net zero and accelerated scenarios, they peak early in the 2020s, and then the new momentum scenario peaks later in the 2020s. The new momentum scenario is the slower of the scenarios for the transition. It reflects a slow pace of transition in some sectors and, of course, varying ambitions around the world. In net zero, you can see the global energy system emissions fall by 95% by 2050 versus 2019. That's essentially in line with a 1.5 degree C pathway. And that's going to require significant changes in societal actions and behaviors to achieve. And then accelerated is one of many scenarios that can still be considered consistent with Paris, which is in line with a less than 2 degrees C pathway. And of course, there are many different versions of this, but emissions from energy use and most industrial processes fall by 75% by 2050. And that varies, of course, between the developed world, which will fall by 90%, and the emerging world, which would fall by 65%. We could go to the next slide, please. So this slide shows a range of scenarios from the IPCC report. This is the 2018 version of the IPCC report. This includes thousands of scenarios, and the subset you see here is the 10 to 90% range of scenarios which are consistent with global warming of 1.5 degrees C with no or limited overshoot. And we've also shown here the 2 degree C scenario as well. And really what I'm just trying to show here is that the BP Energy Outlook scenarios are broadly aligned with the energy scenarios seen in the IPCC report. You can see that in the IPCC report, the decline starts a bit sooner. And also you can see that the use of higher carbon intensity fuels reduces more quickly in the IPCC line. So you see that the decline is more rapid in the IPCC lines, and eventually the two different sources of information start to merge together as you head towards 2050. And remember, this does predate everything that's happened in the world since the Ukraine, so things will of course change. If we could go to the third slide, please, Yasmin. Thank you. So what you can see in this slide is three charts which show those three scenarios I've described. And the first chart shows the change in the primary energy mix for fossil fuels that will occur over the period from now through 2050. You can see in 2019, fossil fuels accounted for around 80% of the global primary energy. And that share declines to between 60% and 20% by 2050, depending on that scenario choice. And the consumption of fossil fuels declines in all three scenarios over this outlook period. And the pace, of course, is something that we can't predict. But what you see in the data here is that renewable energy expands rapidly. That's wind, solar power, bioenergy and geothermal power, and the share is between 35 and 65% by 2050 in all three scenarios. And that's supported in the right-hand chart by increasing electrification of the world to between 30 and 50%. So the spread of electricity as the energy source. And you know, the current rate of electric vehicle adoption is a very visible example. In the outlook here, we are assuming 2 billion electric vehicles by 2050, and that's versus around 7 million in 2019. The pace at which we expect renewable energy to penetrate the global energy system is quicker than any form of fuel that we've seen in history. And of course, there will be a range of energy sources and technologies required to support this deep decarbonisation of the global energy system. And that will include electric vehicles, various types of hydrogen, bioenergy, and carbon capture and storage. And it's worth noting that oil and gas doesn't go away. There will be a role to play over the coming decades. And of course, that will be in lower volumes as fossil fuel reliance reduces. And if we could just go to the last slide, please, Yasmin. Thank you. So this slide looks at the reshaping of the global energy markets as the world transitions to a low carbon energy system. This one is for the accelerated scenario, and there are similar features in the net zero scenario. So those are the scenarios with the more rapid decarbonisation. As you can see, it's slightly hidden, but coal has dominated for much of the past 100 years. And of course, oil has been a key feature since the 1970s. But in this scenario, you can see the transition is to a far more diversified energy mix over the next 20 years or so, with renewables and non-fossil fuels providing a growing share of the world's energy. And as I said a moment ago, alongside traditional fossil fuels. The greater variety and the growing range of technologies will allow for greater substitution between energy sources and carriers to the point of use. And comparing ICE to electric vehicles is a good example, and an example where the fuel mix is increasingly driven by customer choice. So the diversity in fuel mix and the increasing role of customer choice is going to lead to growing competition between the different energy forms as they compete for market share. And that will also happen in the fossil fuels, where competition between individual fuels will likely increase as producers compete to ensure their energy resources are produced and consumed. I've included a bar chart here as well, which shows the fuel mix as it evolves across the scenarios. And you can see, as I've just been saying, the share of fossil fuels falls from close to 80% in 2019 down to between 20 and 30% in the fastest transitioning scenarios. The big driver of that fall is the virtual elimination of coal from the global energy system, and of course oil demand falling sharply as well. And you can see that natural gas is a bit more durable and it declines, but less so than those other fuels. So to conclude, and then I'll hand back to Yasmin, I mean, the future is uncertain and impossible to predict. But what I hope I've shown is that the shift is going to be to a more diverse fuel mix, and a decline in fossil fuels will be part of that. And as you all know, in many ways that is already underway. Back to you, Yasmin.
Thank you, Neil, and apologies for I was a bit too keen with sharing your slides there.
That's no
Hopefully I'll get it right for Alexandra. So our next panelist is Professor Peter Taylor. Peter is Professor of Sustainable Energy Systems in the Centre for Integrated Energy Research at the University of Leeds. He holds a number of other roles alongside this, and Peter's going to share his thoughts on renewables and alternative fuels and government policy to accelerate the transition to low and zero carbon energy. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Yasmin, and many thanks to the IChemE for inviting me today. So yeah, as Neil has pointed out, fossil fuels are still responsible for around about 80% of global primary energy demand, and renewables come in at around about 12%, and then nuclear is around about 5%. And I think the interesting thing is that those shares haven't really changed for more than a decade. So although it's undoubtedly true that renewable energy in absolute terms is growing, the problem is that global energy demand is also growing, and therefore the share hasn't really changed. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper and look into the various energy sectors, we can see markedly different positions. I think it's safe to say that most progress has been made in electricity generation. So renewables are now somewhere around about 29% of total generation. A lot of that's from hydro, and that's been the case for a number of years, but wind and solar are both growing very rapidly. And nuclear also contributes a share of around about 10%. So the role of renewables in providing heat is lower at around about 10%. Mostly that's from modern bioenergy, with some contribution also from renewable electricity, and also the direct use of solar and geothermal heat. It's the transport sector, I guess, where we've seen least progress on renewables. The renewable share there is only just over 3%. Most of that is from biofuels, and the contribution of renewable electricity in terms of electrified vehicles is only a fraction of 1%, so really very small. So looking to the future, what are the prospects for renewables and other low carbon technologies? Well, I think we're expecting that the deployment of a whole range of low carbon technologies will increase quite rapidly as we move forward, as governments introduce policies to tackle climate change. So for instance, the International Energy released a net zero scenario, I think it was last year, and that shows that by 2050, under that scenario, renewables would have a share in primary energy of about 67%, so 2/3. Again, looking a little bit deeper, that actually in that scenario, that means that the electricity system needs to become net negative by 2050, with renewables having a share of 88% and nuclear 8%. And it's through technologies such as biomass combined with carbon capture and storage that we can actually deliver net negative emissions. And under this net zero scenario, we also see an enormous increase in the electrification of end-use sectors, such that global electricity demand between now and 2050 would go up by more than 2.5 times. So for instance, in buildings, we see that electricity has a share of 2/3, much of that from renewables, with biofuels and hydrogen contributing a further 30%. In transport, electrification also occurs, not to the same extent, but under the IEA scenario, electrification or electricity reaches a share of 44%, with some smaller contributions from biofuels and hydrogen. And so I guess an interesting question to consider is the extent to which we think that that kind of scenario is possible. And again, perhaps the prospects vary by sector. So I think in electricity, we probably do have a clear pathway forward. We've seen large increases in solar and wind, as I've mentioned, over the last 10 years. And I think most people would see that trend continuing, and that those technologies would then be supported by a range of other low carbon options. So nuclear, biomass, hydro, fossil fuels combined with carbon capture and storage, to mention just a few. And that has largely been driven by the cost increases that we've seen in wind and solar over recent years, such that now on a levelized cost basis, in many parts of the world, they're broadly similar to the cost of generation from fossil fuels. Although, of course, we are needing to pay quite a lot of attention to increasing the flexibility of the electricity system to accommodate those variable renewables. And if we look in countries, particularly those countries which have a big difference between summer and winter peak in electricity demand, I think there's also an urgent need for longer term flexibility through long-term energy storage, which may well involve hydrogen. Because as we electrify the system, those differences in the peak between summer and winter may grow, and we need some way of dealing with that. So there seems to be growing consensus that probably in buildings and for low temperature heat, electrification is likely to be the most common way forward. But of course, hydrogen from low carbon sources and bioenergy could both play a role, and they may even be more significant when we look at high temperature heat applications, as we might need in industry. When we come to transport, as I say, that's the sector in which so far renewables have had least impact. The electrification of light duty vehicles is now gaining some traction and momentum in a number of countries around the world, and advances in battery technology giving improved range and reducing costs have been an important driver behind that, and that will need to continue for them to play a significant role out to 2050. When we look at other transport sectors, so heavy goods vehicles, aviation, shipping, I guess less progress has been made so far. Perhaps that the future is more uncertain in those sectors, but probably some combination of electrification, biofuels and hydrogen are some of the potential options there as well. So, okay, how are we going to deliver these changes, and what's the role for governments in that? So I think the first thing to note is I think the kind of change that we're looking at is unprecedented in history in terms of the complete transformation of a large socio-technical system like the energy system in such a rapid space of time. So I think Alexandra is going to say something about energy innovation and technology innovation in a minute, but my observation is if you look at the work of Shell and others, then what you tend to see is that it takes something like 30 years for new technologies, once they enter the market, to play a substantial role. And of course, as we know, 2050 is less than 30 years away. So I think it's quite clear that if we're going to be successful in tackling the net zero challenge, we're going to have to accelerate those historical timescales quite considerably. And governments have a range of different policies in the toolbox that they can use to help do that. And I think, just as an aside, I would say that we're going to need all those policies. I wouldn't be somebody who'd agree with what some economists might say, which is, well, we just need to implement a global carbon price and everything will be okay. I think even if that were possible to get such an agreement, that probably wouldn't be the optimal practical solution. So what can governments do? So the range of different policies that they can implement, and I just want to run through in very broad terms what some of those are. So one could support specific technologies, so that could be through the public funding of research, development and demonstration, or for instance public procurement policies. There are price-based instruments, so taxes, subsidies, emissions trading, they would all be common things that governments could do. One can implement command and control regulations, so technology performance standards or the banning of high polluting technologies. And finally, one could have things like information and voluntary approaches, so rating and labeling programs or information campaigns. And I would like to argue that the precise mix of those policies will vary between countries, technologies and markets. But just if we take one example to think through, how we might use a basket of policies to help, I wanted to take the example of electric vehicles. So there I would say that probably both basic and applied research will be needed to improve battery performance and reduce costs. This will include looking for new battery chemistries, but also improving the battery management system as well. So we could use public procurement then to help create the market for electric vehicles, while a combination of taxes and subsidies could be used to reduce the gap between the upfront costs of electric vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles. Labelling can then demonstrate how the operational costs of electric vehicles are lower than for ICEs. And finally, we know that a number of governments are proposing regulations which would eventually ban the sale of conventional vehicles. And so I think we can see, if we look around the world, that the number of governments that are introducing climate policies are growing, and the extent of those policies and the sector that they cover are also growing, and this incorporates not just renewables but many other low carbon technologies as well. And I think that therefore there is a growing realization of the need to take action, and I'm quite certain that the path towards net zero is not going to be easy. It is going to be bumpy. It's not going to be straightforward. There will be setbacks, but I think if we look at the alternative, then I would also like to say that I'm pretty certain it's going to be less painful and less costly than facing up to the challenge of runaway climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I will come back to you with some questions in a moment, but let's hear from Alexandra Meldrum first, our final speaker. Alexandra has been a chemical engineer, economist and director in Australia, where she is joining us from today, and also internationally for 25 years. She worked in international energy, food and manufacturing, and she also brings insights from working in government, not-for-profit organisations and academia. She's Vice President for IChemE's Learned Society, and she's going to talk about the role that chemical engineering will play in the transition to clean energy. So over to you, Alexandra.
Thanks, Yasmin. And it's interesting you chose to share your story. I remember when I was a student and a young engineer, and I used to play a kind of game, chemical engineering is everywhere. And as I looked around, it would be hard to find something that wasn't touched by chemical engineering. And in the 1990s, I was working in the oil and gas industry, and the products of the oil and gas industry were literally everywhere. And we started to see some headwinds with industrial complexes around about well, probably Chernobyl was an early one in 1986. For people of my age, everybody will remember that. And then the Brent Spar got international attention in the mid-1990s. So, like many at the time, I was becoming aware of the broader consequences. So there was this balance between we were part of everyday society and just so valuable, and at the same time, there's harm. We might look at some slides and go through a few ideas, and building on some of the thoughts that Neil and Peter have shared. And one of those first slides that comes up, it's actually a quote from the IChemE blog. So those of you who have read the blog will see, and we can go to the next page, thank you. Those who've read the blog will see that it begins, energy is an integral part of our day-to-day lives, and that's why I began by sharing my story. It is just so integral, not just the energy, but the products and the transport, to get a whole lot of other things as well. And I want to have a broader look at how some of these historical shifts in our energy mix have actually driven tremendous economic and social change. And with each of these, as Peter has said, it's not going to be easy. They've been really dramatic changes, and that's being driven by these complex interdependent systems. So let's look at the next slide. And one of the things that we do, because I'm an engineer and an economist, one of the things we have a real interest in is having a look at our data. And what we're looking at here is one of the models of how society has evolved using economic data. And I've always found it really fascinating looking at how, as societies, we have innovated and developed, and it's been energy that has driven these massive opportunities, the opportunities that came from the steam engine, from the ability to do transport with railway and steel, the electrification and the chemicals. So you could see there were, and here it is demonstrated. And for those who are not familiar with these types of graphs, this is demonstrating the changes in the US stock market, but it also is something that we might regard as a proxy for development and economic development and how that evolves over time. And if we go to have a look at the next slide, and the next slide shows the same things, but just in a different way. Once again, you can see that what is really interesting about these bursts of innovation, and you might hear people talk about the phrase creative destruction, is that each of these new waves of technology is not just a change in one thing, it's a change in society, it's a change in a whole lot of associated technologies. And when you look at what some people regard as the sixth wave, which is what we're heading into, and you think about all of the opportunities that are coming together as energy, sustainability, digitalization come together, thinking about the waves of change. We've already mentioned things such as electrification and just how that will change our society. There's also the wave of connectivity and how that is going to massively change. And there's also a wave of what I might call machine learning and artificial intelligence. So all of these things are bringing tremendous opportunities, but also there's a question about how you move from one wave to the next. And that in itself can be a tricky process. Let's have a look at the next slide. And on this next slide, I wanted to illustrate very similar to what Neil showed before, but I sometimes think it's nice to see the big, bold bar graphs. You know, if we look at how those particular shifts in our societies and economies have been driven by the changes in energy, it's really interesting to see that sort of up until about 1950s, and these are the figures from the International Energy Agency, IEA, up until about the 1950s, our societies were very much built around energy sources such as wood and coal. And it was during the 1970s, of course, that oil and gas really came to the fore. The gas is still growing, and you start to see the small amounts of nuclear appear in about 2000, and then renewables are starting to get bigger now. So I think it's just so useful to relate the development to those shifts in energy use. The next slide is a little bit of fun. It's exactly the same as this slide, but what it shows on the next slide is it rates them proportionally for the size of energy that we're using. And so this is the same as the last slide. I had to show you the last slide or you'd have no idea what was in that very small slice. But you can see not only is the mix of energy changing, but it's important to think about how the actual size of the change is occurring. We'll move to the next slide. So that was looking at historical shifts in the energy use. And I hope that what I've illustrated to you is that we have this pattern of long economic waves, this pattern in which things are, over history, there's this historical repetition. And what that has actually enabled is this innovation in industry, transport, communications, basically everything in our economies and industrial structures. So that's one particular framework through which to look at things, and it does bring together the interconnectedness of the economy and the society and our improved living standards and health. One way that the economists might look at this is to say that this is all driven on what's called a general purpose technology, and some of the things that I've been talking about in relation to electrification, for example, would be considered as a general purpose technology. And the period of time that we're going through now, we're seeing a change in that general purpose technology, which opens the opportunity for innovation. So we'll look at the next slide, and what I'm trying to paint a picture is what we're going through as a society from past, present to future. And part of what it's dealing with is this tension as a society. And many of you will be familiar with the World Energy Council Energy Trilemma. And this is the model of how we need to balance three very important objectives. The objective around environmental sustainability, with energy equity, with energy security. And many would say, if you look at the WEC report from last year, you would have seen that energy security was scoring the lowest last year. And as Neil has already mentioned, we are starting to see big changes, of course, and I would expect that number to be different if it was measured now. So let's move forward, but I think that's an important concept to understand as we consider things such as a fair and just transition, that consideration of sustainability and sustainability, equity, and affordability. Let's have a look at the global greenhouse gas emissions. I put this in here because in a conversation about the transition to net zero, firstly, from the graph on the left, what I want to explain and help people be clear is this is not just about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the larger proportion of the pie, so these are from the IPCC report. And then when we look over and say, where is this coming from, and hence where are the opportunities to make a difference? The graph on the right shows that they're coming from a range of different places. And Peter spoke earlier about the changes in transportation taking a bit longer. Many would say that the changes in industry, especially the hard to abate industries, are really challenging, but they're also great opportunities for chemical engineers to be involved. We might look at the next slide now. So looking to the future, I want to talk about how as chemical engineers we can be a central part of the team for looking at solutions and looking at the future of industry. I want to point out that it's not something we're going to be doing on our own. It's an international effort. It's multidisciplinary teams. These are systemic challenges. They're not going to be solved by any one group on their own. It's about working together. And you can see when you look at those interdependent systems, just how we're going to need to drive change through a broader lens about responsible production as we drive towards achieving climate change, safety, addressing major hazards, and using the digital tools as that wash and new technology comes over us. Those things I've just mentioned align with the IChemE Learned Society priority topics. So certainly we're saying these are areas of interest and areas that we believe are very important to focus on. For interest, IChemE has published, and everybody can see these, they're on the web, a climate change position statement that came out in November 2020. The Chemical Engineers Matters is our technology roadmap. So again, that's something that everyone can look at. We are working on updating that, and it is a useful tool for people to see the varieties of technologies, also to understand the interlocking systems of technologies. Our different groups within IChemE were invited to produce climate change action plans, and several of them did, and we have published those on the website, as well as our publications. So we have a range of journals, which are very important for the creation and the promotion and the sharing of knowledge. So that's an important part of what we do as a learned society, is that we build on, develop and share new knowledge. Let's look at the final slide. And in the final slide, I'm hoping it'll appear. There we go. In the final slide, I want to give people some practical takeaways, because I think it's quite important to think about how we do. As chemical engineers, we can all make a difference. We've all got the opportunity to bring in our professional expertise and to be looking at how we can continue to develop our knowledge and our skills. I've put some ideas on the left about ways that we can continue to learn and to grow. Certainly, I'm a huge fan of continuous education, and there are a range of resources which are available for people to have a look at and to use. On the right-hand side, I've also suggested for those who want to do more than just be informed, but they're also interested in getting involved. We do have an international IChemE energy community of practice. We've got a range of special interest groups. As I said, many of our special interest groups have an interest in this, and there's volunteer opportunities on projects, on groups, and the opportunities to contribute to consultations and projects. So that ends my presentation, and I really want to say chemical engineering is a wonderful opportunity. It's a great chance for us to be part of addressing these issues and moving things forward in that next wave of innovation.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and to Neil and Peter as well. So I'd like to ask you all to start with, scientists have been warning us about climate change and the role that fossil fuels play in that for quite a long time now. I wonder if you have a view on why it's taken us such a long time to listen and start acting, and what we can do to avoid making similar mistakes in future. And maybe I'll come back to you, Neil, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jasmine. That's a hard question, and one which we could spend the rest of our time on, I suspect. But you know, I think it's, you know, I would go back to the trilemma which Alexandra described, and this is a complex topic, of course. You know, energy equity is something which is still happening. You know, there are still countries that are going to provide more energy to more people as we go through the coming decades, and so, you know, for those countries and political systems, access to energy is through fossil fuels. It might be coal, it might be oil, and so I think globally there is a variety in the energy mix and the maturity of the energy system. And I think, you know, as Peter was saying, there's also quite a tapestry of governance and policies and approaches to carbon accounting or pricing, etc., etc. So I think we have done quite a lot, I would say, in various industries. You know, emissions are still increasing, as I described, but they're increasing more slowly. And we've been in action for decades in some industries. But I think the IPCC report and many other publications are telling us we have to act now and go faster. And that's going to be a combination of action by companies, by countries, by governments, and of course a massive role for us as engineers with technology and deploying some of these renewable and other processes to help as we transition. So I think difficult to provide a sort of complete answer without speaking for a long time, but I think we're in action. I think it's just a very complex social as well as economic energy system.
Thanks, Neil. Peter?
I could maybe build on what Neil has said.
Yeah, go for it.
If that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say it's a difficult and hard problem. just as Neil was saying, it is society-wide. It's embedded in everything. It is so much part of our culture, our structures, our societies, our systems, our governments. Making change to new energy sources is a hard and difficult problem. With all these interconnected systems, if it was easy, we would have done it. And so I think that, you know, it's interesting. So, for example, Yasmin and I shared our stories. Part of the change is also making, changing public awareness, because in democratic countries, the public votes for people who say certain things. And so that general awareness has changed enormously, even in the last 10 years. And that's a powerful driver for further change compared to where we were not so long ago. So as Neil has said, we could say a lot, but to me, the things that are holding us back is that it is not an easy change, and it is going to require raising awareness and making sure that people demand it and want to act on it.
Thanks. And Peter, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree to a large extent with what Neil and Alexandra have said. I would add to that the fact that it's a global challenge. I think with some of the other environmental problems that we see that have been caused by energy, so you know, acid rain pollution, for instance, there were kind of end of pipe abatement options which could be fitted, which could address the problem, so it didn't require a sort of fundamental change necessarily in the fuels that we were using, and also it required action at a local or a national or a regional scale. It didn't require global action. So I think there's always been this issue with countries feeling, well, you know, I could take action, but am I going to get all the pain? And actually, we're not going to see the gain if nobody else does it as well. So it's required the world to come together. And as we can see at the moment, you know, the world certainly has challenges on agreeing on things. Secondly, I think probably that the nature of government in many countries, I mean, Alexandra talked about democratic government. One of the challenges there, of course, is that governments get voted out every now and again. And so they tend, I think, to focus more on the kind of short-term priorities and the things that are immediately on people's minds and for which they perhaps can deliver success over an electoral cycle. The problem with climate change is that, to a certain extent, and excuse the pun, it's a kind of a bit of a slow burner. And so perhaps now we're starting to see more crisis situations, if you like, caused by climate change, but historically I don't think we have, and so it's not confronted policymakers in the same way, for instance, as perhaps the 1970s oil crisis did, where there was a real immediate problem that had to happen. Particularly countries in the West became very concerned about dependency on oil, and so they took quite rapid action to try and reduce that dependency, and you can see that in the figures, that to a certain extent anyway, they were successful in doing that. So I think there's a whole bunch of characteristics which climate change has and the causes of climate change have, which means that it's not an easy problem for either governments or society to tackle.
And I guess that's kind of related question to that. So you all gave quite a global view on this, and it's obviously a global problem. How well do you think we are working together as different countries, and could we go further, and how? And yeah, maybe jump in, whoever wants to take that first.
I mean, maybe I could say something on that. I think it's very interesting how our approach to tackling climate change has changed. So if you go back to the days of the Kyoto Protocol, that contained supposedly binding reductions or limitations on developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And at the time, I think it was felt that kind of approach, starting with developed countries and then perhaps eventually spreading to the rest of the world, was going to be the successful way of doing it, because in a way, everybody signed up and we kind of knew what should be being delivered, and in some sense we could end up somehow with some fair burden sharing of the overall reduction. And I think probably what the Kyoto Protocol demonstrated was that approach didn't really work, and then spreading that kind of almost top-down approach more broadly to other countries was going to be even more challenging. So we've now come up with almost a completely different approach, where essentially it's up to countries to come forward with these nationally determined commitments and offer what they want to do by way of a contribution to tackling climate change. And it's then really just peer pressure in a way from other countries, I guess, and perhaps a desire also to help the planet that brings countries forward. So no longer do we have these kinds of targets mandated top down, but it's much more about, you know, trying to build coalitions of the willing to each, you know, for each country to deliver what they feel that they are able to, and the hope then is that, you know, that will add up. And clearly there are weaknesses in that approach. I mean, you know, the existing nationally determined commission contributions clearly aren't sufficient. So the idea that we're going to ratchet these up over time, you know, and that we'll build confidence between countries, and that they'll feel able to go further, and that we'll have technological development, etc., etc. You know, I guess it just remains to be seen whether actually that approach will work, and more importantly, will it work on the timescale in which we've got to deliver change.
It is very hard to think of anything of this size and scale that's happened before. At least it's hard for me to think of it. The example that's often brought up was the action around CFCs and the ozone layer. And that really was such a minor change compared to what we're having a look here. The important thing is understanding that energy is so integral to any society. And so when we're talking about changes, we're talking about countries' ability to look after their people and produce livelihoods. And we're also looking in the concept of trade-off between action now versus action later. So there's a whole lot of different trade-offs. There's the issues about what is fair and equitable. There's the issues also about a whole lot of people who are in countries where they are not very rich. You know, there are people who do not have the benefits of sitting here talking on a webinar like we are now. And so the question of how to bring the world with us is a really challenging one. So I'd like to encourage the audience to think of these concepts of difficult trade-offs. They're important decisions nonetheless. And what is it that we can bring to those conversations that can assist the world to move forward? The other thing is, I'd say that financial disclosure has become a new thing. The money around the world, so enormous liquidity at the moment because of the very open monetary policy that has been operated in a number of countries around the world during the pandemic. A lot of money raised around the world looking for assets, in particular a lot of it driving towards ESG assets, so environmental sustainability, governance style. And where the money goes, investors go, the opportunity for change. So I think that alongside some of the new initiatives around climate-based disclosure and nature-based disclosure are providing some opportunities to move forward. But once again, the concept of tension and the concept of trade-offs, what is working against that is that many of the assets and the opportunities in the energy industry are starting to be taken over by private hands, where they're not subject to those types of disclosures. So it's a very evolving dynamic feast right now.
Yeah, I think just maybe one addition. I think the other thing which is going to help is getting the cost of renewables to be lower, so that alternatives become available, because generally in developing countries, fossil is the cheapest route to energy currently. But we've seen a massive acceleration of the cost curve reduction for the alternatives, and I think the more we can do to drive efficiency and cost competitiveness, the more open those other opportunities will be that are lower carbon.
Just on that point, I would just add that the cost of fossil fuels appear to be cheaper. I mean, sometimes it's because they're subsidized, and often it's because we don't have the externalities priced into the cost of them. So, they are costing us a lot costing us the earth, one could say, but it's not necessarily visible. But undoubtedly Neil's right that as the competing technologies come down in price, so the argument for their use becomes a lot easier, irrespective of carbon taxes or anything else that one might want to impose. I mean, I also think, and I think this is a challenge, that the targets and the kind of the net zero 1.5 degrees, however one wishes to frame it, has changed the nature of what countries are being asked to do. So I worked at the IEA 10-15 years ago, and in those days when we were developing scenarios, global scenarios, we were looking for roughly a 50% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And under those scenarios, it was assumed that developed countries would take the lead, so they would make substantial reductions much beyond the 50%, maybe 80%, and there are arguments around historical responsibility and the ability to pay and all the rest of it that underpin those. Whereas many developing countries, including substantial large developing countries such as India, actually would be allowed to increase their emissions over that same period. Nowhere near as much as they would have done otherwise, but nonetheless, I clearly remember, I think under the 2010 Energy Technology Perspective scenario, India had about 10 or 11% increase between whatever the baseline was, 2000 or something, and 2050. But now the level of ambition in terms of emission reductions is huge. So it's now net zero, which really leaves very little wiggle room for anybody to be increasing their emissions at all. And so, what does that mean in terms of these issues around equity, around historical responsibility? Sure, maybe we would be saying that perhaps developed countries need to meet net zero 20 years before other countries do, but nonetheless, basically everybody is being asked to reduce emissions really, really substantially and under really, really stringent timescales. And I think the politics of that are still to play out, to be honest.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump to one of the audience comments from Dr. Ian Thomas, who picks up on these the issues of poverty around the world and the importance of making sure that we do have this just energy transition. But he's also pointed out that we're moving towards some potentially dangerous fuels and using even rarer minerals and causing harm to species and the environment in general. How do we take that into account as we move into these new types of energy and to this energy transition?
I can talk to it.
And that might possibly be a comment about some of the critical minerals that are required for manufacture, things like lithium, nickel, and none of that is easy. Part of it comes also around where these are being mined, how they're being mined, what regulations exist in the places where they're being mined. I think there's such an awareness at the moment on the issue of being able to secure supplies, and this is not just in energy materials, but it's a whole lot of other things as well. And I think countries are increasingly, and populations are increasingly asking, where has it come from and how is it made? There's enormous change within the mining industry. And as with anything, there'll be differential change. I'm not saying everything everywhere, but there's enormous change, and there's a lot of pressure on the mining industry to ensure that they measure, track, report, have independent audits, and I think this actually is quite an exciting area for chemical engineers who want to be involved in it. We do have quite a lot of new materials that are required for the renewable energies, and it is an opportunity to create new industries, create new livelihoods, but to make sure that we do so following not just the letter of the law, but also our professional codes of conduct, what's right, what's moral, what's ethical, and engaging with others as we raise these issues to the fore, and in effect that's going through a change itself.
Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I often say to my students that one of the problems with renewable energy is actually the only thing that's renewable about it is the energy. So you still require, the bulk materials, the metals, the critical materials, everything else, to make them work, and they are not renewable. And I think, therefore, that leads us to perhaps a missing part of the conversation so far, which is around the role of energy efficiency and demand reduction. So I think that sometimes people say, well, if we manage to power the planet through these low carbon and renewable sources, do we need to really worry about efficiency and limiting demand anymore? Is the problem not sorted out? And I would say absolutely not. I think that there's still far too little attention given to the demand piece, because essentially, if you can reduce demand, then you reduce the size of your energy system, and you naturally reduce demand for, whether it be steel, cement, neodymium, you name it. And that, to be honest, has to be a good thing. And then I think the challenge then is, around, can we do that and still deliver the kind of standard of living that people in developed countries have been used to? And can we do that and still allow the people in developing countries to achieve that same standard of living? And personally, I think the answer to that is yes. I think we can reduce energy demand and still give people the standard of living that they require, but it is going to require us doing things in a different way. And that part of that is technological, but part of that is around the kind of business models and the way that we do things, and this whole concept of a circular economy, which in some ways perhaps a little bit of a fuzzy concept, but I think at its heart, the idea that we need to try and minimize the extraction of these raw materials and recycle and close the loop and use our energy assets intelligently is really important. I mean, if you take the example of a car, I think, I don't know the exact figure, but it's something like a typical car spends about 93% of the time stationary, or maybe it's even more, not being used. So we have millions, billions of cars around the world with incredibly low utilization. Is this really the most sensible use of resources? Of course, we can have a debate about public transport, but also about car sharing. If we have autonomous vehicles, do we need everybody to have 3 cars in a household, or can we have the little car running around and coming back to pick us up and taking us somewhere and being used much more efficiently? I mean, we could speculate on that for ages, but I think the fundamental issue of reducing demand is still one that the world has to grapple with.
Yeah, maybe if I could just add one piece. I think, this is the broader challenge and dilemma, I think, of sustainability. We've talked a lot about net zero and global warming today, but even things like green hydrogen are going to put a challenge on our water resources. And there are some. I think we have to look at the sort of holistic impact of the transition, whether on biodiversity, water usage, things like modern slavery and human rights. It's an ecosystem of many competing items, and I think whether the sort of governments, countries, or companies, we're going to have to look at the trade-offs, as Alexandra said earlier, but more so, we're going to have to figure out the right way to navigate them, because the journey is required. It's just a difficult and complex one.
Neil, there are a couple of, I would call them clarification questions, or questions about how the scenarios work. So one is, to what extent are factors such as methane leakage during production of coal, oil and gas taken into account?
Yeah, that's a good question, which I won't give a full answer on, because I don't prepare the scenarios. They're broad, I would say, and we do make assumptions as to the IPCC and others. There are lots of assumptions about conversion to primary energy as well, and things like fossil fuel equivalents. So I think as best they can, they use industry emission factors and global assumptions, but we're finding, and particularly as you look at things like hydrogen, methane leakage is super important on some of the new energy sources, let alone the existing ones.
Yeah, I would say from experience of looking through that report, all the assumptions are in there. So if the person who asked the question wants to know, I would recommend going and having a look in there. There's also a question about whether the scenarios are skewed towards the view of developed Western countries in Europe, North America, Australia and Japan, or are other countries like Nigeria and India also represented?
Yeah, it's a global view. So and you know, places like India, China, with a large amount of growth in some of the higher carbon intensity fuels are considered. So it's very much a global view.
Thank you. And then a question that I was going to ask about as well, is there a reason we don't expect much change in nuclear contribution to energy supply, but gas and oil remain stubbornly high? And that's for anyone in the panel, I guess. And my question was more general about nuclear and whether it has a role to play and how we deal with the negative image that it has if you do see it as an important contributor to the energy transition.
Yasmin, it's probably a question of different answers in different countries. And so in some countries, nuclear is banned, and so it's not going to be part of the mix. In other countries, it's seen as a very important part of transitioning away from fossil fuels, especially in those countries that don't have the abundant solar, wind and geothermal that might exist. So it's going to very much depend on what are the natural resources of each country. I think it's also important to realise that we're not coming from a standing start. So if we were to design and start with a blank page and we would say, what is the energy system that we would like to create for the world? It would look very different to what the situation we're dealing with now, where countries have legacy systems, they've invested in infrastructure, or they don't. And it would take a considerable amount of effort to create them, all right? And so I think there's overlooking issues here of regulations, what's possible, natural resources of countries, the views of societies within certain countries, yeah, all of that sort of comes together. And we do need to, whilst I talk about we're not on a blank sheet of paper, therefore getting to something that is going to get us to net zero requires quite unique and prepared plans for each of the countries or the entities involved. Now, it's not going to happen in a uniform way. And so that sharing of knowledge, which is a very important part of a professional organisation like ourselves, but that sharing of knowledge and helping people to understand what are the possible pathways to get there, because the pathways need to be thought through and detailed and unique for the circumstances of each place. Now, that's a general answer, but I hope that touches on why nuclear is important in some places and not in others.
Peter, Neil, do you have a view on nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Alexandra said. I would just add to that I think there's also, so if you take the example of the UK, been a challenge about how one finances nuclear in a privatized and liberalized electricity market. So if you look at the kind of techno-economic estimates for the cost of nuclear, they actually look very cost competitive with many renewables and fossil fuels. But then when you actually come to implement a project and look at the kind of funding that might be necessary, and in the UK with the contract for difference system that we have, the one that's been signed for Hinkley Point C, doesn't look all that attractive from an economic point of view. So it will be interesting now that the government in the UK is kind of almost recommitted to expanding nuclear. You know, my question would be, well, what's changed? You know, what's different going forward? How are they going to overcome those challenges which have prevented nuclear from expanding in a way in which, you know, frankly, I think that they would have quite liked to have seen anyway. So I guess we might find out the answer to that, you know, in the next few years.
And if we move to the next question, which is about hydrogen, is it really the best way to provide long-term renewable energy storage? And the transformation from electricity to hydrogen and back to electricity is very inefficient. So are there better storage solutions to be considered? I think, Peter, you talked about this a bit, so maybe.
A great question. Absolutely. That is, you know, and I think chemical engineers have a really important role in helping to answer that. Yeah, I mean, do we want to try and store the electricity as electricity? That's challenging over long time periods. We could turn it into hydrogen. There are losses there. What are we using a lot of this electricity for? If it's for heat, do we turn it into heat and then store it as heat in, you know, underground? I think basically the answer is who knows. I think this is why I sort of posed it, really, because I think it is one of those challenges that the problem is recognized, but the solution, I think it's an open question. What is the right way to go?
Neil, any thoughts on hydrogen as a storage medium?
I think it's sort of it depends question on the country perhaps, and indeed the use and the location. You know, if you take somewhere like Australia, I'm sure Alexandra will have a view, but you know, if there's a lot of renewable energy, whether solar or wind, available, and you can produce something like green hydrogen, then the question is, how do you then transport the energy? And can you become an exporter, whether you know, ammonia, some other liquid fuel? So I think it depends on what you're going to do with the hydrogen and where you want it to end up, whether as a sort of secondary energy or a product. And I think it will differ depending on the economics and the physical location, as well as the use cases. So I don't think it's the panacea, but I think it's part of the mix.
Yeah, I'd agree with what both Peter and Neil have said. It's likely to be part of the mix. It will depend on the natural advantages of different countries, and certainly in Australia at the moment, there's a lot of work going about building infrastructure, developing scale, driving the cost down. I was in a conversation earlier today where they were talking about bringing the cost down by an order of magnitude. Right, so the development in terms of the cost of hydrogen is rapid and fast. It's likely that the opportunities will depend on how fast other technologies moves as well, because clearly in moving to a more electrified solution, part of the question is how do we manage to ensure that we solve the storage problem. And there's many ways to do it, and hydrogen is part of it. Look, the other thing I'd say about hydrogen is it has a very special role in what I'd call the heavy industrial sector. And one view is that in many of the industries where chemical engineers work, that might be concrete, steel, aluminium, those types of industries, very essential goods that are, you know, societies depend on. If we're going to have construction industries and live and work in societies and have infrastructure, so really central things to our society are actually not very easy to do in terms of carbon abatement. So it might be part of the broader question as well.
Thank you. And we go from hydrogen to bioenergy and biofuels. This question says, are we at risk of burden shifting? We produce lower carbon electricity, but impacting the environment in other way. Rather than carbon accounting, should we be pushing life cycle assessment instead? And I guess general views on biofuels and if and where we should be using them. Who wants to pick that one up? Neil, are you?
Yeah,
I have a very short comment. I'm sure Neil's the expert on this. But I was just going to say, in the discussion today, they were saying that it's neck and neck between biofuels or hydrogen in the particular economics that we were looking at, and it's unknown at this stage what is going to be the better solution for transport. But I'm clearly not the expert here. Neil is.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I can give you a view. I mean, I think it's it's a mixed question for me, and I think biofuels have other challenges in that dilemma on the broader sustainability challenges, whether land use or biomass feedstocks and competition. And I think this is where technology and development can help us with things like cover crops and the ability to develop biomass feedstocks during the off season from food crops and things like that. So I think there's a place. I think the challenge is going to be making sure that we balance with the other challenges that the energy transition brings us as society evolves. So biomethane and other biofuels, I think, will help us in some of the hard to abate sectors, things like aviation. And in some countries, there's quite an attraction to things like e-fuels. But again, I think it's going to come into the cost equation, but also then the broader societal issues around biomass feedstock availability.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think that we're going to have to think very carefully about the best applications of biofuels and biomass more generally, and about where it's coming from, the extent to which it meets a broader set of sustainability criteria will be important. And I think Neil's really touched on another really important area, which is not energy and not really my field, but at the moment we don't just use oil for energy, but we use it for feedstocks for a whole bunch of different chemical processes, and the extent to which that might get replaced by a sort of a bioeconomy, I think, is still an open question. It's really interesting. If you look at the IEA net zero scenario, then I think by 2050 the single largest use of oil is as a feedstock still, and basically maybe it's because the IEA also don't know too much about that, but it doesn't really change. It broadly stays the same under their scenario, and everything else is shrinking, and therefore you end up with a really significant share of total oil use by 2050 that's as a feedstock. So yeah, I think we will need to look very carefully at biofuels, because if you go back, I know 10-15 years, certainly in Europe, there was grand targets for increasing the penetration of biofuels, in transport and all the rest of it, and then suddenly the kind of the sustainability reality hit, a lot of bad press about some of the sources and the broader consequences. And I don't think that the transport sector certainly has really recovered from that, which is probably why biofuels still play this rather minor role. So as I say, yeah, definitely a challenge, and one that I think is squarely in the remit of chemical engineers.
Thanks. And there's a question specifically for you, Peter. I think when you spoke, you mentioned that the economist solution of applying a global tax isn't such a great solution. So the question is, why is that not going to work in your view?
Okay, well, first, good luck in getting agreement on what that should be. But then I think even if you did, so the idea would be, that if you're going to set a carbon price, then sort of basic economics would tell you that you need to set that to the marginal price of abatement. So if we are looking at net zero, then the cost of the most expensive option to meet net zero is going to be many hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2. So sure, I'm not saying that carbon pricing has no role. I think it does have a role, but the idea that it might be the only tool that we use, for it to do that, it would have to be set so high to incentivize that last bit of carbon abatement that just nobody's going to do it, in my view. I I think that this is where the kind of sort of simple 101 economics breaks down in reality. I think there are, by using a basket of options, as I tried to outline, it's actually more cost effective and certainly a more pragmatic approach to tackling the problem than just resorting to price alone.
And does anyone else have views on, maybe Alexandra, with your economist hat on?
Well, I guess you think about why does the government need to do anything? And if you were to look at it through an economic lens, so obviously there's a whole lot of other roles for government, but if you to look at it through an economic lens, you might say the reason the government gets involved is because there's a situation called market failure, and that might be because the cost of pollution, for example, is not included in the price of a good. There's no consequence for producing pollution. And that's kind of the argument behind producing carbon taxes. As Peter has rightly said, the instruments as such for being able to have a global tax don't exist. Countries set their own taxes. But there's a whole range of different things, and I think that Peter has mentioned most of them. For example, part of it is addressing the information asymmetry. Do people know? Is there awareness? There's a role for communication for people to understand where things have come from. What was the supply chain? How did it come about? How can I make decisions? And we know in many countries that there is already an enormous alive interest in people wanting to make ethical and responsible decisions with their own procurement. Also expecting that their governments will make ethical and responsible solutions, and that their governments will put in regulation, which is pretty hard and fast kind of economic activity, but to basically regulate certain types of activities. And that's what we might do around pollution or all sorts of things that can happen. So there are other mechanisms. There's ways to develop innovation and support innovation, support commercialisation, and a tax isn't the only answer. A broad suite of activities can be much more helpful.
I just add that, you know, if one was going to do this in a logical way, the first thing, of course, that you would do would be to get rid of the subsidies on fossil fuels. You know, because I mean, the IEA calculates, you know, from time to time what they are, but you know, many hundreds of billions of pounds. It really depends what the oil price is at the time. But you know, go towards supporting fossil fuels at the same time as we're trying to encourage renewables. So it's in some countries it's a bit of a ridiculous situation whereby we you know, we're subsidising both sides, and that really doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense.
Thank you. There's a question about technology and innovation, which I think, Peter, you touched on. So you mentioned the time required to develop technology and the little time that we have left until 2050. So with that in mind, which technologies do you think are currently deployable at scale?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I think we're starting to see that you know, electric vehicles probably are reaching that potential to be deployed at scale. That's not to say that they can't get better, but I think that they are probably you know, one of the technologies that one would expect to take off. You know, Alexandra's also mentioned about hydrogen, and I think, you know, that well, certainly within the next 10 years we would be hoping that that would be in a position to be rapidly scaled up, because it does seem to be the opportunity to reduce costs quite significantly. But I think it is a concern. I mean, is it the IEA Net Zero report or another one where they looked at, particularly in industry, something I can't remember, some quite large proportion of the technologies that they thought would be needed were classed as having relatively low TRL levels, relatively low levels of technology readiness. You know, and I think that has to be a concern. You know, if we're thinking that we're going to mass roll out by 2050 stuff that we basically don't really have any market for at the moment, then you know, we're either really going to have to overturn everything we've done in the past, or we're going to have to look for other solutions. So yeah, I think there may be an issue. I mean, we've left it so long that in a way we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We might have to look at what we've got at the moment and see what we can do with that, rather than potentially relying on what might be the optimal solution if only we waited another 15 or 20 years. And you know, one of the issues, of course, is that there's nothing particularly special about 2050. You know, heading net zero by 2050, whatever, but it's the area under the curve. So you know, the more rapidly that we can make reductions now, the better. And those reductions will need to continue beyond 2050. It's not that we're going to get to 2050 and then just stop. You know, we're almost certainly going to overshoot on 1.5 degrees, as we've been hearing about recently, at least in the UK. So we need to go net negative, and we're going to need those technologies, you know, that can to deliver that. So we're going to have to be making reductions way into the second half of this century.
Can I maybe piggyback on that and say part of the way we achieve scale is by lots of people making decisions that are quite small. And so it's the things like the smart energy grids, the sensors in the home, things which are around lots of people all making decisions that are not necessarily a big decision, but in itself it can achieve a scale change. So I see that digitalisation, new technologies, I think it's going to give us a lot of opportunities, but it is about making sure that those are attractive and cost effective for a very large number of people, but it's heading that way.
Yeah, maybe just one add to what Peter said. I think things like direct air capture and bioenergy with CCS, I think, you know, the amount of removals we'll need through the 2050 time horizon and well beyond that, as Peter said, is going to be very significant if we overshoot, which many think is likely. So I think accelerating and driving the cost efficiency of those types of technologies is going to be critical. And there'll be other things around fixing carbon as we inject it. Inevitably, that there's a lot of research going on, but discovering those other technologies and then scaling them as quickly as we can will be super leveraging, I think.
And that if we take it to opportunities for chemical engineers, so can you comment on opportunities for chemical engineers in the key challenge areas of large-scale energy storage and large-scale negative emissions, and I guess others as well? So what is there out there for us and for those who perhaps work in fossil fuels at the moment and are looking to transition?
I might just comment and say I think there's enormous opportunities. It's going to be different by each industry. Neil will be able to share from his industry, but I think there's enormous opportunities. So certainly people like myself who've worked in oil and gas and moving into other areas, whether they're working in hydrogen, they're working in carbon capture and storage, whether they're working in areas with new technologies, so how we can improve efficiencies. And also, I think it's just so important to understand energy is the engine that underpins an economy. So there's actually opportunities in every other industry too. And so whether you're talking about food or about water or about manufacturing, there's so many opportunities, and I therefore think that chemical engineers have a really good part to play in this.
Neil, are there, is BP looking at?
Yeah, sorry, someone's cutting a hole in the road outside, so hopefully it's not going to be too loud.
Don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super exciting time for chemical engineers because, you know, when I talk to young engineers about development, of course, there's lots and lots of opportunity in oil and gas as we want to squeeze the last drop from existing fields so that we're actually using existing infrastructure and all of those types of things. But, you know, the opportunities in hydrogen carbon capture, but also other things like wind and solar, you know, maintaining wind turbines is actually something that we're spending quite a bit of time on because actually we're through the first couple of cycles of the technology in turbine generators and gearboxes and things like that. So, you know, you could argue they're not chemical engineering, although we tend to get involved quite broadly, as everyone on the call will know. So, but the other things I think, you know, Alexandra talked about digitization and, you know, I think squeezing more and building more skills tangentially from our core skills are going to be really critical as well, because efficiency and demand reduction are so critical as we go forward, as well as being able to sort of build those new technologies. So I think it's a very exciting time where the ability to transition into different career paths is enormous.
And Peter, you're teaching the chemical engineers of the future. So what do you say to them?
Yeah, and I think what we try and encourage our students to do is to think holistically about the problem, to be clear about the role that they can make, but also understand the contribution that can be made by other disciplines. I think more and more chemical engineers are going to be working with economists, material scientists, physicists, chemists, lawyers, whoever, to tackle these challenges, because energy is a socio-technical system. So you've got the technical bits, but you've also got the socio bits, and if you don't get both bits right, then we're not going to deliver the transition that we need. And so I think it's incumbent on everybody from across all disciplines to be quite open, to working together to meet this shared challenge.
Thank you. And we're actually out of time, believe it or not. So thank you very much to the audience who have been, who've kept the questions going, and I wasn't able to get through all of them. So sorry to those that I didn't get to. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, and of course, something that's really vital for the energy transition is that we make sure that it's safe. And that is the theme of next month's webinar. It's on process safety. That's taking place on the 8th of June. So if you enjoyed today's session, then do sign up for that one. And yeah, again, thank you, Alexandra, Neil, and Peter. And I hope everybody has a good day. And thank you very much for joining, and goodbye.
Thank you, Yasmin.